In terms of what we're seeing in the economy now, GDP, you cut it to 2.4% from 2.8. That's the forecast. Exports, then, we get them this week, and they've decelerated again pretty sharply. They're still growing, but the speed, the momentum is really going away. How much is this due to supply chain constraints? How much of a weight are they going to be now on Japan GDP growth, and how long are they going to last?
Thanks, Kathleen, and good to see you as well. These days, it's been difficult to see each other. I think Japan is, it was a good PMI number today. Glad to see that services are now in the expansionary territory. And that's a little bit of the story, I think, going forward for Japan. Due to the positive developments on vaccinations and the reduction in COVID cases, we expect somewhat of a shift from manufacturing to services as Japanese consumers feel more comfortable to spend substantial savings that they have built up. Manufacturing had improved earlier in the year, but as you mentioned, there have been some supply constraints, and we've seen it also in some of the industrial production numbers, particularly for the auto sector. So this partly reflects the chip shortages that we've heard about globally.
So how long is this going to last? 40% drop in auto shipments last month. Again, we know that the supply constraints aren't just chips. They have so many ways they slow things down. Do you see that? Do you see this over by the end of the year? Does it go into 2022, to the end of 2022?
So right now, there's some uncertainty about this. Earlier, when we had discussions with people in Japan, the expectation with some of these shortages, at least the chip shortages, which is resolved by the end of this year, 2021. But we are, as you point out, seeing other supply constraints as well. So that provides some uncertainty to the economy, at least the manufacturing side of the economy. Though the PMI numbers still are improving, so that's a positive sign.
So when you mentioned vaccinations, with 60% of Japan's population now vaccinated, with the lockdowns, emergency lockdown, the fourth one, in fact, ended, do you think Japan can put this behind us? The economy can put the COVID, the pandemic behind it? Or are you concerned that we could see another resurgence that could hit the economy later this year?
Another substantial uncertainty. The positive sign is now, actually, Japan is closing in on 70% vaccination rate for the population as a whole. So after a slow start relative to most industrial countries, advanced countries, Japan has now moved ahead of many. So I think that's the positive part of it. But, COVID has been quite unpredictable. So that's, I think, a potential downside risk. But given the relatively successful vaccination program now, we think that would mitigate some of that downside risk.
Let's move on to the new Prime Minister. Kishida has a new capitalism plan to distribute wealth more equally by increasing tax breaks for companies that increase workers' wages. Wages have been stagnant for years in Japan. Could raising wages create a virtuous growth cycle, one that could even have you raising that GDP forecast for Japan for 2022?
Right now, we have a pretty optimistic forecast for 2022. We raised that to offsetting some of the decline for 2021 to over 3%. I think longer term, though, it could have a virtuous cycle. Part of the benefits, there's always a balance between growth and equity, but we think certain policies can promote both growth and equity. What we call inclusive growth. And part of that is in Japan, you have formal and informal workers. Japan has already begun the process of what they call work style reforms to better balance between formal and informal workers, which will help reduce any inequality. So continuing progress on that, including we hope to see higher wages. We think would help growth by leading to better domestic demand, better consumption.
Prime Minister Kishida was talking about raising the capital gains tax to help pay for this step. Has stepped back a bit now. But do you think the capital gains tax should be raised to improve the country's fiscal health, its wealth distribution, or do you think capital gains are the wrong tool?
So what we've been looking at, well, first of all, we think it's important that Japan continues to support the economy until the pandemic is over. But longer term, Japan has to think about fiscal consolidation. I think you had a graph earlier showing relatively high debt in Japan. But we think there are multiple options that could be considered. And one of those options could be capital gains financial taxes.
In terms of the administration, some members of Kishida's administration have made comments that make it sound like there's going to be a move away from Abenomics. Has Abenomics sort of outlived its usefulness, or does it just maybe need to have a bit of an overhaul to fit the current economy?
Yeah, I think it's more the latter. A large part of Abenomics has been quite helpful for Japan. If you think back to 2013, when Abenomics was started, Japan was facing the risk of deflation. So it clearly took that off the table. And even during COVID, although inflation rates have been low or deflationary for time, that's due to the direct impact of COVID. Underlying inflation in Japan is, by our estimates, slightly positive. So Abenomics, I think, overall was successful, but I think what's changing is mainly the structural reforms component of Abenomics, which will be more focused going forward, I think, on some of these distributional aspects that the current Prime Minister Kishida has mentioned.
You know, Japan's government has a goal of balancing its budget, reaching a primary balance by fiscal year 2025. Would it hurt Japan's standing if they were to temporarily halt this, even do away with it altogether? Would the IMF be concerned if it took such a step?
So our view is, first, it's most important to support the economy in the near term. And in the medium term, we do expect to see fiscal consolidation in Japan. The specific date by which the primary balance reaches, well, the primary balance reaches balance, I should say, is not what we'd focus on at this moment. It's mainly that once we get past the COVID pandemic, to have a credible medium-term consolidation plan.
I'd like to ask you, what is the most important change that needs to occur as a response to COVID? Or, in other words, in the aftermath of everything that is going on right now, what would you like to see next?
I guess the first most important thing is, of course, to support the economy. But as we move, it's to think about how resources in Japan need to be reallocated to promote growth over the longer term. So certain steps, I think, have already begun in Japan. We think it's very good, this focus on digitalization of Japan. The creation of the digital agency last month, we think, should help promote that. Part of the reason for that is we find that Japan is less, despite it being a technology leader in many areas, adoption of digital technologies has lagged behind in Japan relative to many of the other advanced industrial countries.
So, go ahead, finish that thought.
So we think that's a key. Also, steps on green investment, we think are key.
Well, in terms of the 2013 joint statement between the government and the Abe government, in fact, and the Bank of Japan, do you think that it is going to be tweaked at all? You know, there was an agreement to fight deflation. The 2% inflation target was agreed on, taking aggressive monetary policy steps. That's what Haruhiko Kuroda has been pushing for so long now. With a new prime minister and a new team, is that going to change, do you think?
I don't know if it will change, but we think it should stay as it is. We think it's important that both the BOJ and the government cooperate towards achieving the 2% inflation target that is in place, and we think that should continue.